This is Call the Psychiatrist, the show where psychiatrists answer your questions. I'm Dr. David Handley.
And I'm Dr. Abby Snavely.
In this episode, we're celebrating. It's our show's first birthday. We're answering listener questions about us and the show. I assume we'll have some reflecting. We'll talk about why we're doing this and what we've learned from it, and the experience of having patients listen to the show.
Say you like me, you better count the ways.
So I'm a little surprised we made it to a year.
Why?
I didn't think we would last. You know, this thing gestated for 2 full years. This is the 4th iteration of the show. I don't.
I was only involved in 3 of them.
I think so. Right.
Right. That's fair. But this seemed like a good concept. I think largely due to you and your diligence, we have had a pretty consistent schedule, which I do think surprises me some.
Yeah, the summer was hard, but I think developmentally being one really fits us, you know, that we can sometimes stand under our own weight, but we still soil ourselves.
I didn't know where that was going to go. Yeah. I'm like, do we get a name? Do we get...
we babble. You can still make a few words out, but we just make noise. Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe we'll get some frosting on our faces. I don't know. I was brainstorming with my kids the artwork, and that was one of them for a first birthday. You know how you get the baby gets the cake and like
smash it all over the place. Yeah,
but that's also like a wedding, so it gets messy. But I do love a mixed metaphor, so I think it might work. Nobody knows.
Well, I suppose this may be self-indulgent and gross, so I apologize if that's what happens, but hey, we're going to give it a try.
I think the people want it. We got a lot of questions, and I'm excited about it.
Yeah. Well, our first set of questions comes from Mary.
Happy birthday. Great show today on both segments. You always hit some important points. For your next show, how much does doing a podcast influence the way you practice? Has it changed the relationship with your patients? Have you attracted new patients? How do your friends, family, and colleagues react when you reference them in the show? You've had some incredibly moving moments. That man whose therapist died. Oof. What moments have stayed with you?
Yeah, so several of our listeners have questions about our patients listening. So we're going to kind of hold that until the end and group them all together. But in the meantime, so what do your friends think of the show, Abby?
What friends? Because I advertised this far and wide to my friends. And as far as I know, approximately one of them is a regular listener. And the other people, little did they know it was a test of friendship. And so now they're on my blacklist.
I've loved hearing that too. Yeah. All the people you're now mad at secretly because they won't listen.
I mean, sometimes secretly, sometimes not so secretly. Like I can say whatever I want because they're not going to hear it.
That's right.
Or I'll try to like back out of it. My friend, even this weekend, I ran into her and she was so happy to see me, acts like a real friend, and then says, "Oh my God, I watched this show. You probably haven't seen it. It's called Stutz, but I want to talk to you about it." And I was like, "I just did a podcast about it." And then she's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I should probably listen to the podcast," and felt really bad because she's a really nice person. She's probably just busy or something. And then I had to backpedal and just say, well, it's just, there's so much to say. We put it in a podcast, and I've made her feel guilty. And then I felt maybe not guilty, but gross about like making her feel bad. It just gets really awkward, right? But it gets under my skin a little bit. I don't know. I've quit asking. I've quit advertising. Oh, I guess I have 2 friends who listen. And so I'm going to take them as my real friends. I have no more to say about that. What about you?
Well, I told some friends on social media when we first launched, and then after that, there's been no mention of it. And I know a few people listen sometimes, and I appreciate it, but it's never spoken about.
Yeah.
And then it's uncomfortable because you can't actually bring it up, and you can't even really ask for feedback because they can't be objective.
Right.
And so, which is one reason why I think when listeners do email or message us at all, like it really is helpful because there's no feedback otherwise.
I was going to say, listeners, you're our real friends. Like this is actually what we're getting to. One friend asked me, because he doesn't listen to podcasts at all, but I was kind of explaining how the numbers work. And he was like, well, can I like download it and just play it with the sound off? I was like, sure.
Oh, that's what I
Thanks
used
for
to
being
tell people.
supportive.
Yeah, I used to
Yeah.
ask people not to listen, actually, because it was going to embarrass me. And so,
I mean, that's part of the dream. Yeah.
But if somebody does toss me a bone and say they liked an episode, then I have to bite my tongue because I have thousands of desperate questions I want to ask. But I don't want to come across as so needy.
I know. But my aunt, I'll give a shout out. Hi, Kathy. She listens and she asked me about it and brought it up. And yeah, was one of my highlights because it was an unsolicited, by me at least, conversation about the podcast, which does not happen.
While the rest of your family just shot you down.
Yeah. Well, okay, that's right. My husband listens. My middle school age child is our biggest hype man. He runs around telling people about the podcast and working it in. He has stickers in his pocket. And so, I don't know if we've ever gotten any listeners. I know last year he was doing it too. And you said no fifth grade bump happened. But he's really proud of me, even though I think he doesn't really understand, what it's about or what happens. But he's trying.
Well, yeah, and one thing I come back to is friends and family, of course, shouldn't have to listen because they're probably not interested in this. Like, I mean, besides it being too close to it, like it's fine. It's really not the show for everybody. I'm not sure who is the right audience, but
well, I mean,
clearly not people that know me well.
A story that I heard through a mutual friend was that she asked your wife what she thought of the podcast, and she was like, when I hear his voice, I have to turn it off. I don't know. That's hearsay. I'm not trying to get anybody in trouble, but it doesn't sound like she's going to hear this either. So maybe we're fine.
Maybe not. I don't know. She started hyping it more often though.
Yeah.
Because I don't speak of it, and so we were at a neighborhood thing, and she brought it up, and I know that I blushed. So yeah, I don't know. Like she promotes it, so she may not be able to listen to my voice, but she at least promotes it at times.
She believes in you, which I think is important. And I do. I try to tell my husband, I'm like, you do not have to listen. But he says he wants to and he likes it and he's trying to be supportive, whatever.
There's all these spheres of my life, and I'm sure yours too, where we're competent, professionally, personally.
Sure.
There's things that I clearly do well, but as far as the podcast, it just doesn't feel like one of them. It's still hard. It's still vulnerable. It's still embarrassing. And there's something about it that I haven't reconciled, that it's still unseemly. This
is very different from, I guess, the tradition of psychiatrists, right? I mean,
well, even just medical in general. So I was remembering a conversation like when I was a younger teenager, talking to somebody about the fact that doctors didn't advertise. Like there were no ads in the phone book, there were no billboards, there were no commercials, because the profession was supposed to be above commercialization. And I guess somehow that seeped into me. And there's still this tension that I'm being naughty because I'm doing this podcast. But I mean, everything's relative, right? Because there's doctors on Instagram doing thirst traps and, looking for praise every post.
And billboards and deals, right? I mean, all kinds of things. And you're right. So maybe doctors in general, but I definitely think psychiatrists tend to have better boundaries. So we're talking about ourselves, sort of.
What about colleagues, though? Because I mean, I almost find that even more embarrassing. I do have a friend and colleague who liked early on figuring out which people we were talking about.
Oh yeah, that's fun.
And the people we're talking about
kind of gossip. He's overhearing the gossip. Sure.
Right.
And now I think I know who you're talking about. So.
But that's been a positive of the show, is hearing from people that I haven't talked to in a long time, like colleagues. Again, I don't know if they actually like it. They're just, I don't know. It's awkward. It's always awkward.
But there are definitely colleagues that I've heard from that I don't think would just be saying it for no reason. I don't know. I mean, I've heard from a couple people being complimentary. I heard another hearsay of, so-and-so said your podcast is surprisingly good. Okay. Right. We've heard from, I guess, some colleagues that we know, but also some other psychiatrists or therapists. So I think that's also a compliment in that way. But actually, my office partner is one of the one of the two friends that I have in this world. And so
the stakes are high for you.
so I believe her. The stakes are high. I mean, I guess, Dave, you're probably my friend too. You talk to me at least every 2 weeks.
Oh, you don't even listen to the final edit most of the time. I have no feedback
often
loop at all.
Do you know why? Because you were done with it at 3 a.m. before it comes out at 6 a.m. and I don't happen to be awake to hear it.
I'm saying weeks later.
That was a
Weeks
setup.
later.
Well, but then I'm just gonna. But this goes back to the shame, which maybe is the theme of the episode. That I don't know if we should lead into. It's a little cringy, right?
Well, and Mary had a question about, have we attracted new patients? And my answer is no, and I hope that never happens as a result of the podcast.
Well, okay, say more of what you mean.
Well, so one thing I've actually always feared about doing the show is that it'll change the way a patient sees me. You know, I'm not an analyst, and I never ascribe to the idea that you must be a blank screen for therapy to work.
Sure.
But I'm mostly blank. You know, I think that's important for certain types of therapy. I mean, I joke to you that I'm a private dancer. Be what you want me to be. But you know, so when I'm neutral,
specific talent. Yeah.
You know, people have all kinds of ideas about who I am. I mean, some people think I'm Jewish, and some people think I'm Catholic, and some people think I'm older, and some people think I'm younger. Somebody decided I had 5 kids. More than a few think I was educated in the UK. And it's by understanding. But,
I'm sorry. That really got okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, but it's by understanding like why they have the assumptions, I learned something about them that I might not otherwise.
Yes, of course.
But
I don't want to get in the way of that at all. Of course.
Yeah. So if you were introduced to me through this podcast, then you'd know things about my personal life, and then you'd assume that I'm more neurotic than I really am, and it would just muddy.
Okay, don't get ahead of yourself, right? I mean, like, I'll let that one slide. Happy birthday. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, I'm just saying, like, I don't think this is the best. This isn't the connection I would want to make with people is through this. I mean, if people find it helpful, I'm so happy for that.
Sure.
But because I don't know how I'm perceived through this medium, but I know, I think how I'm perceived in a more professional role. So I don't know. It's very complicated. And I know we just sound kind of nuts, but maybe that's part of the whole show, right? Is pulling back the curtain.
I think that's part of what is fun. And so same, I have not attracted new patients. I don't know what that would be like. I think we will talk about some of our motivations later, but my motivation was never to use this as a marketing tool, right? I mean, I know every time you say we're going to educate and entertain, and I think that's probably as far as it goes, though I guess, someday someone may come in and say, I learned about you from your podcast, and then that's going to be fascinating. I don't know what else to say, right? I mean, it's just, right. It's grist for the mill, baby. Like, what am I, it's sort of like, patients that are making all these assumptions about you still know what you look like and what your office is decorated like and how you present yourself. And if people only know us from the podcast, it is a different set of information, and in some ways a more specific set of information, but they may also have fantasies or imaginings about what we look like or how we act, how we dress that our patients know and the listeners don't. People are filling in the blanks various ways, and this is just a different set of blanks we're providing people.
Yeah, but it's harder to monitor it, right? Because there's so much information out there that I don't know.
Well, and we're also not interacting with anybody specifically when we're talking. Right. We go out of our way, I think, to imagine what the question asker is asking, but we also go out, right? But we also go out of our way to say, a lot of times we're just making guesses. And that's some of the fun, is to be able to make a wild guess based on a few lines of text, and we also aren't dealing with a whole patient in front of us.
Yeah. You have such limited information. Because you had too much information, then we'd be getting into treatment. I mean, we would be getting into very difficult ethical waters. And so, yeah.
And part of the reason this is usually fun is because it's not all of that, right? I mean, I don't still want to be at work in the exact same way.
Right.
To your credit, you are funnier in real life, but you play the straight man on this show, and I'm much more brilliant and eloquent in real life, but I'm the comic relief, so we both have to make concessions.
It's interesting, right? Because there is a part of my image that it's not that I'm not being authentic. It's that I'm conscious of it, though,
Yeah,
right?
it's a version.
So,
It's just a
mhm,
version of
a
yourself,
facet.
right? Yeah, a
That's right.
facet, if you
Right.
will. That's
Right.
right.
So, what moments have stayed with you?
I agree with Mary. I think the person whose therapist died was incredibly moving for both of us, and kind of a reminder that there are folks out there listening to this show in earnest.
That's the episode where I thought the podcast could mean something to someone,
Mm-hmm.
and that I don't know, maybe this could be helpful, whether it's just educationally or
Mm-hmm.
maybe as a source of support. So anyway, I agree with Mary. That's the one that has probably stuck with me the most.
I think that moment sticks with me. I think the psychedelics episode was one of them that I felt the most proud of. I think that was episode 10. I know you did a ton of work about, especially about the historical pieces, but that felt like one too where maybe the other side of it, the educational part, felt particularly salient and effective. And then some of them I think were just fun. I think the one about the notes was really fun to do. And sometimes the questions have made me stop and think through in a structured way some parts of my practice or how I think about things that, maybe I take for granted or just kind of hadn't operationalized fully before. And
Hmm.
so I don't know. I don't know if you had other ones to add.
Yeah, the educational stuff. It's hard. It's hard to.
Yeah.
Again, there's not enough of a feedback loop. I don't know. Sometimes is this too long? Is it too boring? Is
Mm-hmm.
it too much history? Is it? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
well, I can critique all of them all day. So,
And you have.
and I
Yeah.
have, and I do.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, maybe, yes, you're right. Maybe as far as from an educational standpoint, maybe that psychedelic one was okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, shall we move on to Yolanda's questions?
I think so.
All right. We love Yolanda.
Thanks, Yolanda. Yeah, we do.
We don't know Yolanda, but she's participated before. Let us send you a coffee mug or something, Yolanda. Just send us a message. We'd love to give you something. So Yolanda writes, I've been listening to you for many months and love your show. Since you asked about questions for your birthday episode, I'm curious about the following. What is the best thing about having your own podcast? How did having a podcast affect the relationship with your patients? There that is again.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think psychedelic psychotherapy is something you need to experience before you administer it? What's something you've learned in your own therapy that you brought to your work as a therapist? And then she had a final question, which we're going to hold off on because we actually think that would go, we're going to put that into maybe a longer episode or in a different theme about the edges of therapy in the waiting room.
Yeah.
All right. So what's the best thing about having a podcast?
I get to hang out with my friend every
Yeah,
week and talk
yeah.
about it.
Every fortnight
Truly.
we get to talk.
Every
yeah.
fortnight, indeed. What about you?
Yeah, it's good because I have a hard time making time for friends, and so this is at least obligation to,
Right.
which is not a
Right.
bad thing. We get to talk about work without working.
Mm-hmm.
And, as time consuming as this is, there's a creative element to it. Like I'm doing some audio engineering and editing. I do all the episode artwork. And so
Mm-hmm.
you can see that some of the podcast players have that, I think, but I feel good about that. And that could be fun.
It makes me think through things. It makes me hang out with my friend. It allows me to be a little bit creative and to push myself, right? That this is something different. There is the unseemly side, but there's also probably just an anxiety side about exposure or having something maintained for posterity or whatever it is that is probably helpful for me to get over that type of anxiety and be more comfortable being a little bit vulnerable in a semi-public space.
I like having a different way of maybe teaching people about psychiatric care. So that's the best part.
Mm-hmm. That is the best part. Spread the word. And we get to watch TV and talk about it.
Right. Publicly. Do you think psychedelic psychotherapy is something you need to experience before you administer it? I think it shouldn't be a requirement, but it's a good idea. In the same way, I think it's a good idea to go to therapy if you're going to be a therapist.
I think that's right. I went to the Psychedelics in Psychiatry conference last month at MGH, Harvard, and it seems like the groups that would maybe certify a person or give them some sort of designation in psychedelic therapy think that you ought to. I think it's a part of the big training programs. And so, I think in a similar way, to therapy, knowing what it's like, having experienced it. Maybe they would say opening your mind in that way could be helpful. I don't know if you have any opinions for yourself, but I think the official line is exactly what you said. Probably a good idea, but not required.
I think from a historical perspective, psychiatrists always tried a little bit of the medicine they were peddling, for better or for worse, right? So,
Exactly.
little opium,
I mean,
little cocaine.
How could you know?
Little Milltown.
I mean, we have such unfun medications these days compared to that.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
What's something you've learned in your own therapy that you brought to your work as a therapist? So this is I'll tie into what we were just talking about. I think that for me, it's greater empathy for the process, like how vulnerable it feels, how dysregulating it can be, that it's not always going to feel good. And it's kind of like that question about experiencing psychedelic psychotherapy. Like, I don't think gastroenterologists have to get a colonoscopy before they do colonoscopies, but you know what? If they did, it would make them even better at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I know I've referenced my own therapy and my own therapist several times. I had to go to a training analyst as part of the psychoanalytic training. He had been my therapist already, but so this is a person who is much older. He's classically trained. He knew all the rules that I certainly pushed against a lot. And so I think the rigidity and the classical nature of how he practiced was pretty informative to me. On one hand, I think certain parts of the frame that maybe I didn't always like or think were important actually proved to be promoting safety, including kind of starting on time and ending on time, having a container, having a predictability about it that I liked. But then there were other things that I think he did in this pretty rigid way that, maybe that was how it was supposed to happen, but kind of didn't work for me. I mean, one that comes to mind was continuing a medication I had taken for a while, and he did not want to give refills. And as a policy, did not give refills at the beginning. And so every month I would have to ask for a prescription, receive a written out paper prescription, take it to the pharmacy, drop it off, go back and pick it up, like the whole thing. And when I confronted him or asked why, he said, well, it's so we can talk about the medication. But here's the deal. Like, we didn't talk about it. It would just be like every month, and I have to ask him and go through this whole thing. And then some amount of years into it, suddenly a number of refills appeared on my prescription. And I was like, really? Like, now? What's up? I mean, I probably asked him if he was like dying or something, because that was always my fear. And he's like, no, I finally realized that I was making your life harder, and we're probably not going to change this medicine because we haven't. And so I'm just going to give it to you. And so whatever his supervisor taught him, or whatever piece of orthodoxy he thought he was holding on to, I mean, maybe this is just a story about me being right, and I need to go analyze that further. Right. But there is a part of it where it's like, no, it's good to know the rules, but it's also important to know what's behind the rules and to see if they really make sense to still apply. And so I think in some ways I try to hold the frame in certain ways, but I also try to have, maybe like you, have more empathy for people, or at least consider that some circumstances might require me to bend or flex or, approach things slightly differently, especially if it makes sense, or at least be willing to think if it makes sense for that person at that time.
That's such a bizarre anecdote. I mean, to do something in such an arbitrary way because that's how you're supposed to do it without any reflection. I mean,
right.
Your guy is old. He's been doing it forever.
Right. It's like,
it's really surprising.
Do you own stock in the prescription pad company? Like, I don't like what. Right. Well, and at the same time, right? Because when I started, I was a resident. And so I had supervisors, including people that I really loved and admired, that I thought were every bit as good of psychiatrists, that were just like, I give everybody, once it's established, I give everybody 3 refills or 5 refills because, they don't need to hassle with it. I don't need to hassle with it. And we'll talk about it. And for anybody who may be listening, and I know we'll talk about our patients later, I give different numbers of refills depending on the scenario, but I am definitely not trying to do something that is onerous on the patient. If it's a controlled substance, or if we're in the middle of an adjustment, or we need to have a conversation, I might put that in as a reminder of a conversation. But again, my point is, like, this was never a reminder of the conversation, like dozens of times.
Mm-hmm.
It was just like, okay, here it is again. We're doing this again. It's the end of the month. So,
all right. Should we move on to the
Yeah.
next one?
Sure.
Okay, this is from Anna.
For your birthday episode, congratulations. I have 3 questions. What do you think is the future of psychiatry? For example, are either of you considering psychedelic use in your practice in the coming year? 2, what has been surprising to you over the year from your podcasts? Are the questions what you had anticipated? Number 3, what would you like your listeners to ask?
So I think on the psychedelic one, you just talked about earlier that you went to a conference just recently.
Yeah.
Also, for our listeners, so we practice in Colorado, and Colorado just passed last month Proposition 122, which among other things decriminalized the personal use, possession, growth, and transport of a lot of hallucinogens, including DMT and mescaline. So at least out here, things are going to get messy pretty quickly.
Indeed. Does that mean you can prescribe it though?
No.
Mm-mm.
The thing is, I don't know. It's going to be really confusing. I want to have access to the drug in a clinical setting, but I know it's not going to unroll out here the way I would probably like for it to. I mean, nobody's going to go to a psychiatrist is what I'm trying to say. They're going to go find some guru out in the forest and trip.
I don't know. I don't know that it's nobody. I definitely have had my patients asking me about it. I am interested, kind of as I think we talked about in the psychedelics episode, but I am interested in these compounds as another tool in the toolbox, if you will. And so I think some people with an established relationship might come to a psychiatrist. I think maybe some people who might otherwise be risk averse or have some sort of stigma about these sorts of things might feel comforted by a medical setting or some sort of follow-up.
I want to be able to offer it. I don't know that it's going to happen in the next year. So I think we'll try to, you're already making steps to be able to offer it. I haven't yet just because I'm trying to wait and see how things shake out. But yeah, there's people I see now. I would love to have this as a therapeutic option for them.
100%. Yeah. So considering, absolutely. That's an unequivocal yes from me.
Okay.
But what that looks like and when is very much to be seen. Yeah.
So what's been surprising to you over the year from the podcast, and are the questions what you anticipated?
Well, you already said you're surprised that we did it.
Yeah.
What else?
I didn't know what was going to happen. Yeah, you know, I didn't know what people would want to hear about, but I'm ultimately glad that it's more listener driven.
Yes. I think it has been great for it to be more listener driven. One of the things that surprised me, though maybe it shouldn't have in retrospect, is how therapy heavy the questions are versus medically oriented, which in some ways is also more fun for us, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, so when I say, I look back, of course, people are curious about their therapist and what's happening. And I suppose that the medical facts are more easily Googleable or not as much open to interpretation, at least in people's minds. I don't know. I don't know if you have other thoughts on that.
I was glad of that too. You know, when I looked at other podcasts or similar podcasts before we started, there's some perfectly solid ones done by psychiatrists that are just giving lectures on a topic. And I didn't want to do that. Even if the topic was interesting, I knew that we would get bored.
Or educationally valuable. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
I mean.
And so I felt strongly that it was better to have some kind of context or anecdotes or stories. I wanted things to be humanizing. I think that has worked. But yeah, in terms of people being so interested in how therapy works, I guess I was I'm glad. I guess it was refreshing.
There's also good therapy podcasts out there, but yes, refreshing. Go ahead.
No, I was thinking about episode number 5. That was the one on erotic transference. And I wasn't surprised that the topic came up because it's so common, but it came up really early in the show. And I guess my surprise was I didn't think people would trust us enough to handle something like that. And so I think that's the point when I knew it was going to be that the show itself would be different from what I expected.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. And I like the range of questions, right? From small things like what are you writing in your notes, or to my therapist died. I mean, again, that was surprising, both in terms of content and, like you said, that someone would trust us to help with that.
Yeah. And I was glad we didn't get such discrete questions, about like medications and things, because I read that disclaimer all the time that we can't give medical advice because that would be unethical. And I think people really understood the limitation. And I don't know, I really appreciated that.
Well, we like all types of questions, I guess is my point. But the therapy ones I think are easier to play with, and that's probably better for everyone.
Yeah.
Or get creative with. Yeah.
The other thing I'm surprised about is I thought it would get easier, and it hasn't.
I don't know what you're talking about. The editing, the talking, the what?
I think that each episode is worse than the one before until the moment that I have to publish it. And then it just goes out into the world and I accept it as an imperfect creation. So,
right?
I don't know.
I think that's why I don't always listen, because I'm just like, it's over.
Yeah.
Like I
nothing
set it
I can
free.
do about it. Right.
Right. Or even when you talked about how you could come home from work and like not remember what happened during the day. It's like, yeah, that was done. I was in it while I was in it. And now my life is moving on. I'm very zen. I'm very in the moment.
Yeah, that comes through.
That does it. Yeah. And so, this is the part where I'm exactly how I seem. I'm just very chill. So yeah. Well, and also just there is a little bit of a roller coaster in terms of, did people respond, and are we going to have more questions? And, I think that part, maybe feeling so emotionally vulnerable to the process is a little surprising too.
Yeah, that's what I think. I was trying to say that earlier. It's
okay. Sorry.
No, I'm glad you brought it up again. It's strange to feel so vulnerable about something that, it's not like these is not new information for us. Like we do this all the time, but there is something about the performance of it, doing it into a microphone, setting it free for people to do with what they will, to judge us basically.
Well, and sometimes, right, we'll be talking before we record, even on a different day. And it's like, oh yeah, this is good. We have so much to say. Or you'll say, well, this could be the episode. We just have to recreate it. But then we get in front of the microphone and push record and it does not flow the same.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it is. It's hard, and not just the performance part, but how it's received, and wanting to grow it, but also in an authentic way.
Just an update, I guess, on maybe this is a good place for this. I talked about episode 5, the erotic transference. We actually got some feedback that's before we recorded this episode from the person that asked that question.
Oh, cool. Read it.
Okay. Hi, I don't know if you get many emails to thank you as a follow-up, so I thought I'd do just that. Thank you for advice in episode 5, Romantic Feelings in Therapy. I was the one who posed the question, and your advice was very helpful. I had a very open discussion with my therapist in the spring, and we spent several sessions processing the feelings. Over this past year, I feel that I've made significant progress in therapy, and I really think getting this issue out in the open and having a psychiatrist that handled it so well and with so much compassion has deepened the therapeutic alliance and allowed me to talk more openly about many other things. Truly, knowing I had a couple of psychiatrists with your podcast giving me advice about this matter made me feel reassured to talk to mine about the romantic transference. I continue to enjoy your podcast. Much luck to both of you in your future with this endeavor. You probably reach more people than you realize. Have a great holiday season. So, yeah. So I don't know.
That's so nice.
Yeah. I know. I'm really appreciative of that.
Next time we are in the depths of despair in terms of our self-esteem, we got to pull that out. I don't know. We got to get it up, get it somewhere where it's accessible. If you're only as good as your last review, that was an excellent review. So thank you so much for following up.
Right.
And truly, I know we're making fun of ourselves, but that's pretty great. And I think does make it worthwhile. To the final question from Anna, what would you like your listeners to ask? I think whatever you're curious about, right? I mean, we want to go to all the places.
Yeah, I think the questions are great. I feel terrible that we have questions we haven't been able to get to. And
I know.
Sometimes it's because we worry it won't have a broad enough appeal. We also got some very reasonable questions about us, and I got afraid of doing it because I thought it'd be too self-indulgent. I thought if we answered it too authentically, we would be disclosing too much. It would be cringe-inducing. So I don't know. I guess today is an opportunity to test run that, and hopefully we can go back and revisit those questions.
So people, if you want details of Dave Hanley's life, you got to flood our inbox with requests. We have to have an undeniable mandate from the people to answer, or else it's just not going to happen, which is all your loss, is all I'm going to say.
Yeah. I mean, the goal is to get to all the questions, and I would be fine with longer episodes, more questions, although I'm not sure if that's what people want. And I'm also quite sure that we don't have the time. So
I think that's fair, right? But I think there are things that, yes, anything people are curious about, we want questions. And I definitely like the follow-up. That felt pretty good. So anybody who has sent the question out there, follow up or tell us where we went wrong. Or if you really want to come, you could be a guest on the show and we could talk about what happened.
Mm-mm. Yeah, I can probably reassure. I can reassure everybody that all the mistakes that are made in the show, I can promise you, it's not because they weren't obsessed over.
Right. I mean, right. I don't have a pithy comment for that. You just did it to yourself. Good job.
Yeah. And then I said this in an earlier episode, but people have asked things that I would not have thought to include if I were trying to make a syllabus. And I love it. I love it that it's things that maybe they've come up and maybe they haven't, but it's just, I wouldn't have thought about that being on somebody's mind. And so I've loved that. So I hope we get more of that. Yeah.
That's right.
All right. These next ones come from Sarah Reese. This is our podcasting sister in England.
Yeah.
Ask the Therapist. Yeah. She writes, "Happy birthday. What was your motivation for starting the show and has it changed over your first year? Also, what have you learned?" I had a lot of motivation. I don't know. Do you want me to start?
Please do. You had enough motivation to take 4 passes at this. So be my guest.
2 years in the trenches.
Right.
I know so much about the podcast industry. I never thought I would know. So the background is that I love podcasts, and I've loved podcasts for a long time. I love having parasocial relationships with these hosts. There's this intimacy with listening to podcasts that you don't get in other places. There's the sound of somebody's voice in your ear hole. It's very personal. And, I used to get invested. Years ago, I used to listen to farming podcasts, and they were independent and they were locally made, just like ours. But I'd get excited to find out if that guy's goats tore down the new fence. It was this nice, comforting thing, like if you're driving or doing chores or whatever. And around that same time, I had this major job change, and it was done so that I could have more time with my kid. And I have no regrets about the decisions I made, but I missed being part of a team, having people to collaborate with, having colleagues, and I really miss teaching. And so I guess with the podcast, I was intrigued about the idea of maybe educating people who aren't in the medical field or in the behavioral health field. And I was just interested in what it would be like rather than, working with a patient individually. Like, is there something that could be valuable to other people in a broader context? Could you cover more people with the same amount of effort?
That's a great answer. We have slightly different memories of this, but I do think a few years ago we were hanging out and I thought we were being fun and witty, and I was like, we should do a podcast. We should
And are you sure you said that, or did I say that?
This is what I mean. I don't know who said it. I don't know who said it. But I thought once I was like, it was your idea, and you're like, no, it was your idea. And so now I'm thinking it was my idea. Have you flipped?
Well, I had been percolating on it for so long up until then that I think I was maybe sounding you out to see what you thought of the idea.
Okay.
So I may have just led you into saying
I mean, I woke up the next, that's possible. I'm very gullible. But right, I'll do whatever you want.
I may have hypnotized you. I don't know.
But then I feel like, woke up the next morning and you had an outline and an idea and you were like workshopping titles with people. That
I think there had been a lot of preparation. I think I was ready for action.
I think you were ready for action. So maybe I arrived at the right time. Maybe you puppeteered me into it. We'll never know. So I think everything you said, yes, to teach.
Which, by the way, I mean, there's thousands of podcasts out there that have that origin story where you have a couple of drinks with a friend and say, we should start a podcast. Is that right? Yeah.
Well, I know
and it's because
like
you think
joke.
You're brilliant. Yeah. You're we're funny.
Right. We're funny. We're right. This is so entertaining. I'm so entertained. Why wouldn't other people be entertained? I think it's everything that we've talked about. I think it's most of what you said. I mean, not the same life history part, but similarly, I had worked at the medical school and the medical campus for 9 years. Going into private practice has been great, but I miss the team. I miss talking about things. I miss teaching. I still do some teaching, but not as much nearly as I used to. And Yeah. And to do something that is, fun and educational and entertaining and keeps me on my toes, I think is all there. You do so much in terms of the editing and the promotion and things. I just have to show up and be the talent. It's pretty awesome.
That is a burden though, right?
It is.
Okay. So has our motivation changed? My motivation to make a positive impact is the same. I don't always know where to go. I don't know. I think we said this earlier. I don't know what works and what's not working.
Mm-hmm.
I pour over all the statistics, but they don't tell me anything.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if we can operationalize it. I think that, the goal of doing it at all and putting it out there was pretty great. And then the goal or the motivation of making it to a year and getting 24 in a year was good. And then I don't know, for next year, I would feel good if, the questions keep coming and much of it is the same. I also am motivated to be better in my performance to make the editing process easier on you.
Thank you. That would be wonderful.
I'll do my best.
All right. What have we learned?
Well, I think we learned some things about who the listeners are and what they want. Maybe we've learned or uncovered, maybe you already knew that, some of our insecurities or performance anxiety in a way that wasn't there. So a little bit about ourselves. I don't know.
I think this has been like great exposure therapy. Sarah, who asked
100%.
this question, did an episode on perfectionism, and this has assaulted my need for control like nothing else. I mean, short of fatherhood, I guess.
Okay, fair enough. Hopefully we'll get to questions about parenting in a different episode, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, it's like,
teasers. Yeah.
Well, it's like if you're writing something, you get to ponder it, you edit it again, you get feedback before anybody really sees it. Or even if you're teaching in front of a class, at least you have humans looking at you that can give you some idea if you're on the right track or not. And, with this, you never know, and it's never completely right. There's always a better way to say something.
And even writing out a script didn't really work.
No, because it was too boring.
Some of those earlier, stiffer, more boring ones, that was what we were trying to work out.
Yeah.
Right? This in-between place where we can be conversational and not lectury, but still not totally unhinged and rambling. Which, I mean, how would you say you cut it down by 50% every time? Like how much editing?
At least.
How much gets at least?
Yeah. Sometimes 2/3, sometimes 50.
Because sometimes we just start talking about other things and the whole thing has to be cut out. Not just because it was like bad information. It just didn't have anything to do with the question.
Oh, right. Or we're too honest. But, unlike a professional thing, we don't really have the luxury of time to re-record. I mean, I guess we could, but then we wouldn't have as many episodes. And so I don't know where you struck the balance. Right. But yeah, I don't know. You have to do it. And then it's forced me to just say, well, it's not great, but it has to be done and it's never going to be perfect. So yeah.
It's good modeling. It's good.
All right. Should we move on to the last one?
I think we should.
All right. This is the cumulative question about how the podcast impacts patients. So this will be our final segment. Well, with one other question there at the end. But so this is from Matt. He asks, have your patients commented on the show? How much do you think about your patients listening when you record? And how much do you wonder about them listening when you have your appointments? Now, Matt is a psychiatrist. He wrote some additional context. I enjoy contributing psych stuff to podcast as a guest, but sometimes feel hypocritical because it's a lot easier to say my ideal work into a mic than to do that work in the room. Also, I run a lot of Comic Con panels and run into the situation of performing in front of patients unavoidably, and I have to remind myself it's good to model creative activity. But, my answer I know is so much easier than yours, Abby. I mean, do you want me to try mine first?
Yeah, go for it, please. Jump in.
Because for me, it's like with friends and family and colleagues, it's just never mentioned. And I try really hard not to link myself professionally to it for reasons that I've already talked about. I have a couple of people that I know about it, and a couple I suspect know about it. But regardless, it's never mentioned. Honestly, there's a few people that I wish I could mention it to because we'll be talking about a topic that we've covered on the show.
Yeah.
But, it gets back to feeling unseemly or muddying the relationship. So I have not had to struggle with this as much. I mean, I'll get to his other questions about how much do I think about it, because I do think about it a lot. Yeah, we've talked about this, and I think for you, this has created some robust experiences with some of your patients.
Yeah.
And I know you can't really talk about it, but I'm so curious. I'm as curious as the listeners, because I know that it in some ways it has deepened the treatment, or it's gotten people to talk about things that they weren't sure if they should talk about or even could talk about.
Right.
I don't know. It's been wild, and I think you've got a great academic paper that could come from this.
Right, right. I mean, we've already discussed my reservations about putting myself out there, but sure. Yes, everything that you said. There are a handful of people who know about the podcast, came across it in different ways. Some, I think, avidly listen, and one that I know has kind of decidedly stopped listening. And as they say, everything's grist for the mill, but this is uncharted territory, right? I think some of the pieces that are easier to handle, not that I think any of this is bad, it's just tricky. Some of the things I think that are easier to handle are, like you said, a psychoeducational piece or a reiteration of the idea that I really want to hear whatever somebody has to say or whatever comes to mind for them, whether it is about an erotic transference or a negative thing or whatever. And that introducing the idea that other people are also having intense experiences with their therapists, and maybe my patients aren't alone, and that they can hear me say that. I think other times when it's more challenging, or when it has been more challenging to me, I guess just in terms of what the patients hear or have heard, is like you said, I don't know exactly how they're hearing it. Hopefully they come back and tell me, but it's not a real-time feedback. And as we said, we're answering questions from folks based on what we imagine about the listener. And so what we say on the podcast, like Matt says, might be an ideal. It might also be a standard. It might be that we're talking about a type of therapy that I'm not even engaged with. The patient experience is so varied. I guess I worry sometimes about being mistaken, or like you said, we're in people's ears, and it is intimate and it feels personal. And I can imagine from the patient side it being sort of confusing, where it's like, well, Abby's voice is in my ear and she's talking to me, but I have to remember that she's not really talking to me, even though she's going to be talking to me in a couple hours in her office. I don't know. I know that I'm kind of rambling there, but I think that part is interesting. And then also just, getting feedback on the podcast or fielding questions about the podcast, which I'm happy to do. But again, it introduces more information about me. And I'm always mindful of trying to keep the focus on the patient and the work they're trying to do. And I don't want to be self-indulgent or get off track. And I guess, I worry about introducing something that is complicating someone's treatment unnecessarily.
I think your experience has reinforced my fear, because you essentially introduced this other facet of yourself, and that was destabilizing. Now, you could say in many ways that was a good thing.
Yes.
But in other ways, sometimes it's bad, or maybe not it's bad, but it's messy and it gets even more complicated. So
right.
You just lose some of the purity. And I guess, of course, what I'm interested in is in the ways that it actually helped. Not that you can go into the details, but that's fascinating to me, because I can only focus maybe on the ways that it would hinder things.
Right. I know, because even when you say your fear, I'm like, no, it's actually not bad. I mean, I think in some ways it's an enriching experience. I mean, I have a patient who has a lot more experience in podcasting than I do. And I think in a certain way, I guess we could talk about, is the patient taking care of me too much, or is it messing up the hierarchy? But I think in that way, it's kind of helpful to both feel like we have something to offer each other, maybe, right? And for someone who might feel kind of diminished. I'm sure you've heard that complaint where, a patient might say, I tell you everything about my life and you know everything about me and I don't know anything about you. And again, I think that's for a good reason. But I think that it also can be esteem building for someone to have something to offer. I also think that my position as a podcaster, we talked some about our motivations. I guess maybe I should have said in that segment, I think when we started, I didn't have a lot of motivation, except that I thought it would be fun and interesting and kind of see what happened. And I think I clarified things as it went along. But me having a podcast is also, I guess, a screen on which to project other ideas about what my motivations are, right? Are we trying to grow a business? Are we trying to find patients? Are we trying to monetize this? Are we trying to get it out every week? Are we, like what is going on? And so it is a different aspect of my life, but I think it still is an opportunity to learn about my patients through the assumptions that they make about me and my podcast, both about what I say, but also why I do it, or what my relationship with you is like, or all kinds of things. And so I do think that's helpful. And I think that that's helpful in understanding the patient and understanding how their mind works, which I guess at the heart of it is always the goal, at least of that kind of therapy. And so I don't think it's all bad. It's just, and maybe it is also exciting for me in terms of the challenge of thinking about additional dynamics in a whole new way.
Yeah, I understand why this question came up so much for listeners, because it is extremely interesting. And there's going to be something here later on, I think, as we keep doing this, if we keep doing this.
I think so too. Oh, wait, are you breaking up with me right now?
You always think that every month.
Well, listen, I know.
Just keep you
it's my
stringing you along.
anxiety. I'm like, wait, what? Is this our last session? I promise, doctor, I'll be good.
So he then asked, so how much do you think about your patients listening when you record? And then how much do you wonder about them listening when you have your appointment? So like while we're recording and then during the sessions. So my answer to this is I think about who's listening all the time, because I'm always struggling with that balance about being human and vulnerable and the complications we've talked about. As far as when I have an appointment, how much do I think about it? So I think I want to tie this into his comment about the potential for hypocrisy, in that we may talk about the ideal way things are supposed to go and then perhaps the way they go in reality. But what I think about my patients may be thinking, it's more to do with the type of therapy we're talking about. I think if there's a disconnect between what we talk about and what happens, it's not hypocrisy. It's because there's so many forms of therapy. So for example, like our listeners are really interested in the relationship they have with their therapist. And there's a particular kind of therapy where I pay the most attention to the relationship and I make a lot of interpretations about the relationship. But that's not the right therapy for all my patients. And so
Correct.
I guess sometimes I wonder if a patient's wondering why things are being conducted differently. So like if I'm doing a CBT, or maybe it's somebody where it's really just behavioral activation, or maybe it's just even solution focused, like I'm still paying attention to the relationship, but us examining it together may not be that helpful for that person. Right. So I guess sometimes I do that little calculation in my head. Like, do they think I'm supposed to be doing this differently because that's what I said I do? And it's the answer is like, well, no, I do it with other people, just not with you. So.
Right. And what does that mean? And then you're back to talking about the relationship again, but when really you're talking about the routine or whatever that is. No, I think that makes total sense. And maybe no surprise that you worry about it a lot, and I worry about it some, and maybe somewhat defensively. I think that I just try to do my best to generally say what I think. I guess this is a part of what am I thinking when I'm recording. There's definitely been times when we are recording an episode about a topic that is particularly salient for one of my patients at that time. And so I guess that the complication there is twofold, right? One is that the answer that I'm going to give is probably unavoidably informed by that patient if I'm thinking about that particular topic with them. I also, don't want to say anything that's hurtful or misleading, or I hope that the patients who listen, if they have a reaction, feel comfortable and willing to bring it up with me. I mean, I think, there's certainly the possibility that people are listening that I don't know about, or that people will discover it later. And so in that way, I guess I do try to let it go. We take great care, maybe this doesn't need to be said, we take great care to disguise our patients sometimes when we're telling anecdotes and things like that. But that doesn't mean that somebody wouldn't recognize themselves in the story, right? Like nobody else would be able to, but they know what went on. And these things are distilled down. We're trying to make a point. We're trying to teach something. And kind of like Matt said, it's an ideal version, but that's also generally how we teach, is to say, this is what we want to go with or aim for, or here's the kind of standard-ish structure. And then I think, Dave, you and I do a good job of going through all these different possibilities. But, even the best laid plans are going, or most carefully laid plans, I won't even say best, are going to change when somebody's in the room, right? Like we can think we know how they're going to react, but we don't. And so I don't know. I guess it's a tough balance of trying to honor the relationship when we're talking, both, with the listeners and with our patients. And then I guess when I'm in a session, I don't wonder about if someone has listened to the podcast unless I know they've listened to the podcast, which maybe I should, or maybe, I know we've done a podcast about it recently. And so I think about it, but I guess I'm not always wondering if people are listening or have found it. Probably I was a little bit at the beginning, like a little more skittish about it, but I really do try to let it go. And I know some of that's defensive and some of that's probably good coping, but I think I would make myself nuts if I was thinking about it all the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's see, a couple of things you said. When we're on the podcast, we're trying to talk to the person that wrote the question. You're not talking to the patient who might one day listen.
Right.
But I hear what you're saying. That gets confusing or complicating maybe if it is a patient. And then another thing, you said this in the last episode, which I really liked, is that, of course we veer from the ideal state all the time, but it's not that we don't think about that we're doing it differently, that we veered from the ideal state. And I think that's the stuff of supervision, right? Like why did I veer from the ideal state? What is that about? Like, is it, that's what the patient needs? Is it something else about my needs? Like, I don't know. And so I think it's always okay to talk about this as maybe how we think it should happen, but this is how it needed to happen right now. So.
And it doesn't mean that we did something wrong, right? Like you said, if we veer from the ideal, I don't know what else we would want to call it, the ideal, the standard, the whatever, it doesn't mean that it's less than ideal. It could be different. It could be more ideal for that patient, or at least responsive to their need and their specific situation in a way that, again, hopefully is helpful. Or I think at least in this kind of therapy says something about our relationship with the patient, which is not something that's ever going to be standard.
This is all unpredictable. I mean, you can be with a person and think like, oh, this is probably how it's going to unfold for them, but you don't know. It's going to take 1,000 detours.
And you don't know the details
before you get there. Yeah.
Right. This isn't a manual, and even the manualized therapies, or the people that practice manualized therapies, you can't just like robotically read a quote over and over and expect it to land with every person. Like, it's just not going to work. Yeah. It's like, then you say this. Well, it probably, even if you're supervising, right? Well, you might say this depending on what that person said and how they act and what their body language is and where they're at that day and what you know about their history and everything else. Every person's going to be different.
Okay, well, before we close, I just wanted to acknowledge that we got a question from Harold, and this came after we'd already recorded our last episode about Stutz, and that episode got delayed. He asked about us reviewing it. You guys should review the Netflix movie Stutz. What do you think about it? What does it say about the power dynamic between therapist and client? Will this movie help destigmatize therapy? I think we probably covered his first couple of questions, but I just wanted to, do we have anything to say about the destigmatization for that show?
I don't know. I mean, I think that I personally have a stigma against unboundaried therapists. And maybe some people would be excited about having that kind of relationship or access to a therapist in a way that feels good. But I also think it was loose. The boundaries were sketchy. He was making jokes about sleeping with Jonah's mom. And then that whole thing at the end, laying on the bed, I guess free associating, or I don't know what was happening. I think it could be disorganizing and anxiety provoking. So maybe, but I'm not sure who thinks that that's therapy. And it's a representation of a real specific thing that I'm not even sure was therapy by the end.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I think you're 100% right. I'm not sure that showing that version, and again, because it was a documentary, it wasn't his therapy, but suggesting that those boundaries aren't important, I think probably won't be that helpful for people.
I don't think so either. I mean, I guess I think it's good that celebrities are talking about being in therapy if we think that people admire celebrities.
Well, they do. So yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that destigmatizes it, right?
I think that does destigmatize it, that people will talk about it. But Harold, we really appreciate you writing in with a question. Thank you.
Yes, Harold, thank you so much for taking the time. And thank you, Mary, Yolanda, Anna, Sarah, and Matt for the questions. Thank all of you for listening. If you have questions, you can send an email or leave an audio message at our website, callthepsychiatrist.com. You can also message us on Instagram or Facebook at Call the Psychiatrist. And if you can't tell, we'd love to get feedback.
Please.
Finally, please tell a couple of your friends about our show. It's the best way for a podcast to grow.
Yeah, and the best way to test if they're your friend.
That's right. Take care.
Bye.